Welcome to the Evolution Partners podcast, where I talk with the world's leading thinkers, planners, and doers who are helping to build great companies in their own way. We learn how the work they're doing is creating an impact and get to know a little bit more about them and what makes them tick. This episode is brought to you by Evolution Partners, where we help leaders to confidently build enduring great companies using our proven, structured, strategic planning process that ensures you build and execute the right plan. Check us out at evolutionpartners.com.au. Also, you can check out our books, Made to Thrive, outlining how to be a great CEO, as well as Onboarded, which is about making your new hires more effective faster. Ashley Ross has been professionally involved in coaching for 39 years, working in and with many countries and many sports. He's coached athletes across genders from grassroots to world championship winning teams. He's built systems and structures to help Olympic-facing coaches and is a certified trainer of coach developers with the International Council for Coaching Excellence, the leading global sports coaching organisation. Ash, thanks for joining me today.
Brad, thank you for the opportunity. I'm really looking forward to sharing a really neat conversation with you.
Beautiful. So I'd just like to start for our audience by saying that we often talk about the concept of leader as a coach in business, that the leader as a coach is one thing we should aspire to be, and that in order to grow your business, you must grow your people. Okay, so for the audience, throughout today's conversation, I asked listeners to consider themselves as the coach of their team and how the insights Ash offers as a coach of coaches can relate to that. So there's a bit of context there, but thanks for your patience on that, Ash and audience. So let's jump into it. So you've said that sports coaching is all about people. How did you come to this realization, and can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, I suppose as background, Brad, I'm not a very good cricketer. Cricket was my game, but wasn't very good. But I always wondered as to why everyone else was very good at, the players I was working with. I was fortunate to work with Shane Warne, Brad Hodge, Merv Hughes, Dean Jones, some of them really great players. And like always, I learned far more from them than they ever learnt from me. But having not played the game at a great level, professionally in Australia, it's generally considered that if you haven't played Test cricket, then you really can't coach at that level. So I thought my only way of actually having any credibility with the players was to try and pack myself with as much knowledge as I could. My educational background, I was a phys ed, diploma in education or a bachelor of education, but I really worked hard in the tactics, technical, mental and physical, what I would call the professional knowledge around cricket, and packed myself with as much knowledge as I possibly could. Made sure I listened carefully, asked questions, and worked as hard as I possibly could, and very fortunate to then get an opportunity working with the New Zealand cricket team. And again, I thought it was my knowledge that would give me some credibility with these international players, Vittori, Fleming, some of the great New Zealand players that are achieving great things and continuing to achieve great things on an international stage with Baz McCullum, was coming through at that stage. So I thought, again, my credibility was dependent on having as much professional knowledge as I could. It wasn't until 2000 I was working with the New Zealand cricket team, and we'd won a world championship in Kenya. It was the first time that a New Zealand side had won a world championship, and I'd been coaching for 16 years, and to be fair, I was pretty full of myself. And so I was flying from Christchurch, where the High Performance Centre was, to Auckland, where New Zealand cricket were based at the time. And as you do, I'm sitting on the plane and talking to the man next to me, and he said to me, "So, what do you do?" And I very proudly said, "Well, I'm in cricket." And he looked at me very excited, and he said, "So, what do you do? Do you bat or do you bowl?" Now, admittedly, I was younger then than I appear now, but even then I was too old to be playing. So I said to him, No, I don't bat or bowl. I coach." And he looked at me strangely. He said, "Well, you're not in the cricket game." And I thought, as I said, full of myself after the World Championship and 16 years coaching and having coached a women's team to a World Championship as well, I came back pretty strongly and said, "No, seriously, I am in the cricket game." And he thought, and he looked at me and he said, "No, you're in the people game." And that was an epiphanous moment for me. I realised that he was completely correct, that this was about what my athletes could do rather than what I could do. And so I then had to start thinking about, how do I communicate? How do I make sure that they've learned? What are the structures? So this became the focus about how did my athletes feel so that they could then go out and achieve. And so it was that moment that changed the direction, and I understood that the professional knowledge was important, but that wasn't critical. What was critical is how my athletes felt about going into battle, putting their self-worth on the line in front of the shining lights, and how could I help them achieve those things. And I had a dear colleague who's working in the mental skills area, a guy called Gilbert Inoka, who for 20 years was the leadership coach of the All Blacks. And he described what he did and what I did. We were working closely together as removing the impediments that the players put in front of themselves. And so that became very important to me, that I realised that there was this talent base. These players worked incredibly hard over their journey, and a lot of the stuff they were struggling with was their own self-doubt.
Yeah.
And the voices inside them. And it all looks easy to us people who don't have the ability to sit outside, but everyone has that self-doubt. And it was really about building the people up to ensure that they could access what their hard work and their, if there is natural talent, was actually allow it to come out, rather than trying to produce, was trying to release the work that they'd done. And that becomes a people focus rather than a front foot drive or an outswinger focus.
Yeah, awesome. I mean, obviously there are some really clear parallels to what we do. I mean, we distill everything down to say a company is just people doing stuff. And what's implicit from that is that, well, we've got to get the right people doing the right stuff in the right way at the right time, and therefore coaching and working around with them. So you dropped a couple of names before, Brad Hoggs and so forth. But for anyone who's Australian, Shane Warne is the guy. And whilst this isn't a cricket podcast, to give some context for those who aren't familiar or Australian, because we've got an international audience as well, Shane Warne unfortunately passed away a few years ago, and it was almost a national day of mourning. He was such a big deal in this country. So my question around that is, when you get really high talented performers, because he would have been, I would have to guess, one of the top 3 or 5 in the game ever. When you get really high performance, high talented A players, how do you coach? Like, how do you chuck out the traditional toolkit, or like how do you get the most out of an A player? Because I reckon they probably know that they're pretty good.
Yeah, and that feeling that they're very good really provides confidence, which you need to have when you go out into battle. So, I challenge the coaches that I work with now. It doesn't matter what sport they work in, but could you coach Tiger Woods? And obviously I'm talking about when he was at his pomp. And invariably, my lesser coaches will say, no, because I don't know golf. But my best coaches will turn around and say, after consideration, yes, I think I could coach Tiger Woods. To which my follow-up question is, well, what's the first thing that you'd say? And my great coaches will all say, what are you working on? Followed up by, how can I help? And those to me are the two most central coaching questions that you can ever ask, because in the end, Tiger Woods is Tiger Woods' best coach. So a lot of the stuff that I do when I work with athletes is just hold a mirror to their thinking, or indeed with coaches, hold a mirror to their thinking, and simply be to ask a very simple question of why. So for Tiger Woods, what are you working on? Oh, I want to stop hitting it left, let's just say. And I'd be just asking, well, has there ever been a time when that hasn't been the problem? Yeah, well, what was the thought process, what was going on at that stage for that to occur? And then getting him to reflect on those things, and then how can I help might be as simple as, can you get me a technical coach? Or can you video? Or can you ask me questions? Or can you observe that? Because in the end, coaching is generic. What these people do is very specific. And indeed, now when I do coach development, the hardest coach development for me is to work with cricket coaches, because I have an opinion.
Yes.
I think it should be done this way, or I think it should be done this way. So if there's a disagreement, sometimes the disagreement is around the professional knowledge. If I've been working with an AFL team for last couple of years, invariably when I have a conversation with the coach, my conversation will always start with, look, I know nothing about the game, but I'm interested how you communicated in this way. What was the impact on the group? So these are generic coaching questions. how do we ensure that learning has occurred? Because we understand that often we tell them and we think they've learned. And that's quite obviously not true. And so having an education background is to just be able to, again, stimulate their thinking around what they've done. And so, well, where in the learning process are they? You've told them something, so that's actually providing them with surface knowledge. But how are we going to move them forward to having deep knowledge? And then that notion about transfer of knowledge, or some people will talk about know, understand and do, and then being able to do in the game. So the understanding that there's a learning continuum rather than I have told you therefore you should be able to do, and sitting in coaches' boxes watching coaches just lose their marbles completely because they've told someone something and expect it to be carried out like that, which really is a fundamental misunderstanding of the learning process. And so to gently be able to walk them through that in the week post, because I don't intervene on match days, because my feeling is that intervention is learning interrupted.
Yes.
So I want them to do it, then be able to talk to them about it, walk them through the process, try and develop an understanding so it becomes their understanding rather than my telling. So that's what I think my skills would be actually trying to just ask good questions and help them towards a position of understanding, which has got some evidence behind it, and then move them forward to a change in behaviour going forward. And that's where the stuff I do with sitting in situ with coaches is probably the most impactful way of changing behaviour, because you see it 2 weeks later after we've made an action plan about how we're going to move forward. You've seen that change of behaviour, so you know that behaviour's occurred. Where traditionally we'll send you to a course. Well, Brad, you and I have been to enough courses to have walked away inspired, but we know 6 months later nothing's changed.
Mate, it's freaking entertainment. It just drives me nuts. The concept of training, or CPD points to use a professional term, where it's actually not learning. It's just I went there and I entertained. That speaker was good because they were funny. Is not good. I almost dropped a swear word there, but I totally agree. I want to go back to what you said there, because the first thing you said is that, what are you working on? So if you're elite, you didn't get there by accident. You know what you're working on. You know exactly what points of your game or what's happening need the work. And that's where you can, I guess, open the lid to the important questions. So what's the importance of asking good questions and then reflection to a coach?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the other thing that does, it puts the person, whether the athlete or the coach, very, very central to their development. And we understand that what we're doing is we have to build a relationship. And part of that is to make sure that we have trust in that relationship, because we understand that you don't get and keep trust, you keep getting trust. And so from my initial conversation with Tiger Woods, with Shane Warne, what are you working on? Puts them central to it. It puts them in a position of respect. And then how can I help? Everyone's comfortable with support. So that's a way I'd like to inform what I do. And then for me, this notion of reflection is key, because John Dewey, the great educationalist, said incredibly accurately that you don't learn from experience, that you learn from reflecting on your experience. And for me, I often will speak to coaches or athletes and I reflect. I sit in the car and think about what happened. Well, that's thinking back rather than reflecting. To me, reflection is quite a systematic process. So I want people, rather than thinking about what happened, I want them to think through what happened. And that's where I think questioning becomes very important, because I scaffold their reflection process and make sure that the reflection process gets to an action plan that's where the behavioural change will occur. And then, as one of your previous guests, Graham Winter, will speak beautifully about the notion of closing the loop to ensure that behavioural change occurs. And that's where I think my discipline has to be, because it can be a coaching chat, and that's fine, but to be a coaching conversation, we go through a process, the simple coaching cycle, if you like, which is plan, do, review, and then adapt. Where a lot of people I see in business and in sport, they plan and they do, and then they plan and they do, and they plan and they do. And it's what I call the busy cycle. Because they'll say, oh, I'm too busy to reflect and adapt, and therefore they never get any better. And therefore they're always busy rather than always getting better.
What's really, I guess, fascinating for me is that you come from a completely different world, but in our coaching business, we've got a few coaches here in Australia and New Zealand. In our coaching business, we are always asking about good questions. Like, it is like at the core, and always asking for reflections. Like every single strategic workshop that we're doing, we're asking leadership team members for reflections on what's happened. So it's just fascinating. I don't know how it came to be. Maybe it's just, context or time at the stumps, for want of a better term. But yeah, it's fascinating that from our perspective, we're doing exactly the same thing.
Yeah, and for me, that's my constant search is for a better question rather than a better answer. And I have a dear colleague who says to me beautifully about a great question is it should have a broad paddock but a strong fence. So my broad paddock question generally starts with, what are you noticing? And then my strong fence might be about how we played in the back 10 overs of the game.
Yeah.
So what are you noticing is very broad paddock, but then it's not about the girl they saw in the crowd or no, we draw them back down and have a really strong fence around the last 10 overs of the game. If it's in a cricket sense, if it's in a coaching sense, working with a coach, what did you notice about how the players reacted when you were giving them a spray at 3/4 time? To be fair, not that good coaches give them sprays anymore. Those days are dead.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, the media like to think that's what modern coaching is, and modern coaching is not that at all. Modern coaching is about being very player-centred, understanding what it is that the players need, and it's more what I would call the art of coaching rather than the science of coaching, which reflects my journey as well. I was very much in the science of coaching, technical, tactical, mental, physical, and it wasn't until I had the epiphanous plane trip that I realised that no, it's about the art of coaching is where greatness lies.
So if good coaching is about good questions that get the recipient to reflect, then how does a great coach know what defines a great question?
I think you know that you've asked a great question when 95% of the talking is done by the athlete. What you've done is you've created a broad paddock with a strong fence, so it's very much on topic, but they're a really, really wide reflection. By listening and being truly present, you can hear where the gold nugget potentially is, and you'll follow their attention. So this is where you'll hear something, and then it might be there's something there. So then your next question or your subsequent question will be around that, and then from their response there'll be something else. Oh, I can see that there's a path here. So I liken it very much to almost like mining. I know there's a gold nugget here, but I'm going to ask questions and ask questions and ask questions, and it's going to draw them to a point by following their attention where they find the gold nugget. And there's a great coach called Wayne Smith who was All Blacks coach, and he said it's very much easier to motivate someone to a goal when it's their goal. And I find the same way, that if I can get people to an understanding of where the gold nugget is and it's their gold nugget, then that's far more impactful than me telling or leading them in that direction. They just get to that. And so I think the best coaching that I've ever done is when the player turns around to me, the coach turns around to me and says, geez, you didn't do much. And that to me is where it's really high quality coaching has been, is I've just created an environment where they found it out for themselves.
I love it. Tell me, did you watch the TV show Ted Lasso? And yeah, what's your kind of take on that? First of all, I guess not so much on character development, but what's your take on that as a show? How does it relate to what it's actually like as a coach in a professional team? And what other kind of comments you got around Ted Lasso, given it's your industry, let's say?
Yeah, look, I thought it was brilliant. I'd be really interested as to, I know who the writers were, but I'd like to know where their insight came from, because it was so insightful. But it was insightful about life, because really, coaching is about life. So, every episode was just dripping with gold nuggets. So I must admit I've devoured it 3 or 4 times and see something new each time. But certainly colleagues around the water cooler at different clubs or wherever you'd be, did you see the episode last night? Or we talk about that, and it's just part of coaching vernacular. So whether you're the goldfish or, people who underestimated me all my life, there's just these one-liners that instantly click off a whole range of conversation within people. So, yeah, I thought it was fantastic. There were some great messages in it, but to me there were some great messages for life, not just coaching.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It was, you know what? I liked it. It was actually just a positive overall message about life, and they didn't need to create or to do sort of, I just loved it. It was the positivity of it was really nice.
Yeah. And I think what was best about it was how it was so beautifully packaged in a comedy.
Yes.
It made it so digestible, so that people with no sporting background could just love it for the comedy it was, and then those that were really into it could just see the real messages that were lurking beneath, which is why it was so beautifully written. So as I said, it's not just the writers, but who was giving them the insight as to this is what really happens in the change room.
What a good question. So you say that you've said already today that you're not an expert in the game, and the challenge comes for you as a cricketer when you go to coach cricket or coach the coaches of cricket. So you said you're not an expert in the game, but you're an expert in coaching. So how can you coach if you're not an expert in the game? And does it matter, or could it actually be an advantage?
Yeah, look, great question. And for me, when I went to South Australian Sports Institute, which is all about creating environments where athletes move themselves forward towards Olympic medals, etc., I was there, and then I think there was 8 sports that I was working with, and none of them was a sport that I had any background in. And people who, when I started the position, say, well, how are you going to coach? Isn't that going to be a disadvantage? And it was very soon that I realised it was an incredible advantage, because none of the coaches that I worked with were ever going to have a dispute about the technical or the tactical or the mental or the physical. Our conversations were always going to be around coaching, and so that made me much more acceptable to them. That meant that they saw me as someone who was going to talk about learning, talk about their self-control, about how they were getting better as a coach, about how they were communicating, how they were learning. And so the work that I did within AFL, there was a survey around that I think it was 93% of the current coaching staff across the AFL, their fundamental coaching background is playing. And so I offer something completely different to that, because I have no playing experience, and they also understand that I'm never a threat to their job. So they see the stuff that I do as being able to supplement something that they don't have any great background in, is around the communication, the teaching, the learning. How do I pass my message on? How do I control my emotions so that I actually enable my messages to be clearer and to more relevant? So again, around this notion of the art of coaching, not necessarily the science of the sport that they're playing. And that's why, the messages that I can talk to with corporates, or any particular sport, doesn't really matter, because the focus is on the interaction with our humans, which is really where we're in. I work with people who might be playing football, or might be playing cricket, or coaching football, or coaching cricket. But fundamentally, I'm coaching people.
Yeah.
And so that development of relationship and that ability to gain trust, build a relationship where I can ask these questions and probe them, and that's part of hopefully some of the skill is to know when.
Yeah.
I had a colleague, the guy who hired me at Sassy, asked me within the first 6 months, what do we expect to see? The typical question that you get. And I said, look, to be perfectly honest, in the first 6 months you won't see much, because what I'll be doing is just developing a relationship. And to his credit, he turned around and said, that's great, because if you had said anything else, we would have thought we got the wrong person.
That's quite reassuring, isn't it?
Which was great, yeah. It gave me the opportunity to make sure that it was focused on relationship, because all my colleagues, they all understand that fundamentally we're in the relationship game. You build a relationship, and then, and only then, can you do the coach development. Where a lot of people who jump into this, first of all, they want to leave their mark. So they'll observe something and they'll be wanting to have an impact with the coach. And the worst thing that you can do is do that before they're ready. So again, we're very much coach-centred, in the same way that great coaching at the moment of athletes is athlete-centred.
Yes.
So we do the same thing. We're very much coach-centred, and you'll get a feel when they're ready for for development. And often it will be, they'll come to you and ask a question about, you've watched a session, but it might be your 5th, 6th, 10th session. Some of them might be the 2nd session. Some of them might be the 10th session. I come and see, what do you think? What have you seen? And invariably, the coach developer response will be, well, what did you notice about your communication when you were standing in front of the players? Again, broad paddock.
So what's the mistake that you often see coaches make? Because you are a coach, you were a coach, you've transcended, for want of a better term, and now you train and coach elite coaches. And so is there a common mistake that you see them make, or behaviour pattern that you often see? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think one of the things, particularly when a coach has just been engaged or just been employed, or as a young coach, they're impatient. They want to make their mark. They want to be seen to be a good coach. And so I often refer to them as sort of a ticket punch coach. They want to go in and say, I'll give you 10 pieces of information here, and they think that's going to make them a good coach. Where in the end, one of the things I often speak to these coaches about is making sure that you have cognitive empathy. Doesn't matter how many things are wrong. To be an impactful coach, you'll know all the things that are wrong, or the things that need to be adjusted. But the impactful coach will look at all those things and say, okay, what's the 2 or 3 or 4 things that and this is how the rowers would refer to it, that's going to make the boat go faster. What are the 4 things? And then being able to prioritise those 4 things, and then having discipline to stick to those 4 things, even though there's 15 other things that are going wrong. What are the 4 things that are most critical? And do I have the discipline to stick with that and simply address those until they're ticked off? And then you pull out of your back pocket the next one that goes in, the next one, and the next one. And very much this notion of cognitive empathy is around the player who's in front of you. Does this player, do they have the capacity to take on the information? Or am I providing the information because I think that's what the board members will think I'm a good coach, because they can see me telling the player 15 different things, even though they've played their 3rd game and they're playing in front of 50,000 people who are screaming their name because they may have made a mistake. So this notion about the art of coaching, I think, is really central. We get a lot of people focused on the science of coaching.
And that's it's a real challenge, I guess, in sport. Is the pressure is enormous. Everyone's got an opinion in sport, and the media has a huge microphone, be it through whatever medium. We certainly see that in Perth with the 2 football teams. It's a really unique, isolated environment.
Yeah, and I see a lot of stuff that forces you down the notion of being a transactional coach. Wins, losses, those are the things, and therefore it pushes you towards being transactional, where the great coaching, I think modern coaching, would be far more around developing the people and being a transformational coach. And there's a lovely story. One of the coaches in the States, he was coaching a high school basketball team and they just won it all. And so he was cutting down the net, as they do, to souvenir the final. And ESPN put a microphone under his nose and said, Coach, you've got to be so delighted with the season. Now, you won it all. It was an undefeated season. And this wise coach turned around and said, to be fair, I won't know how successful this program has been for 20 years until I see what these men have become. There's the definition of a transformational coach. And the interesting thing is that focus on transformation increases your transactional outcomes. People who focus on the transformation end up getting much, much better outcomes because of that focus. And that's a hard one for people to necessarily line up who aren't really inside the 4 walls.
But it applies exactly to what we do in business. There's transactional people around business improvement or business planning, but the real results come from compounding, and that's what we do. So I love it. How would you define a coaching professional?
I think the public would say that's someone who's getting paid. And that's someone who I would call a commercial coach. Someone who's getting paid. A professional understands that they're not here for themselves, and they've been able to take themselves out of this notion about, particularly as a player, they're often very self-interested, self-centred, as they necessarily have to be as a player. But coaching to me is the most selfless task that you do. And so the ability to be a professional coach is to understand what I'm really here to do, and that is to develop someone else. And so this notion that when we win, I push the athletes forward, but when we lose, I take a step forward and take responsibility, not complete responsibility, but take responsibility for potentially when things have gone wrong. And that to me that starts to define leadership. And certainly the big push in coaching at the moment is around the coach being a leader and understanding that. That's where I see such similarities with the great work that you're doing and the work that we're doing with coaches, about understanding that it's about their athletes, not about them. And that in the end, this focus will actually lead to success rather than focusing on the success. And the parlance that I'll use is we stick into the process. Well, the coaching process is really around this notion about the art of coaching rather than necessarily the science of coaching and getting to know the people.
So the book that you're going to tell me about soon is by Will Guidera, right? And this feels like a perfect moment to talk about that. Unreasonable hospitality. I'll come back to that and ask that later again. But unreasonable hospitality is really about that. So how does that, what you've just described, connect with Will's philosophies there?
Yeah, I mean, for me, when I read it, looked at his YouTube, because he's all over YouTube, it was just this notion that it's about the personal experience. Is that you've got to move from what we think about the customer, our athletes being a commodity, and move to them about, no, they're an individual. And so how do I bespoke their experience? How do I extend their experience in order to develop a connection? And through that connection, that's when I can have great conversations, or high performance conversations, which sometimes aren't all that pleasant. So a lovely story, one of the teams I was working with last year, one of the AFL teams, there was a line meeting. They broke up into lines to make the coaching easier. So it's forwards, midfields and the backs. Anyway, one of the lines was coming together into a line meeting. And so there's about 8-10 players, big burly footballers, and they do all these silly things. They'll have different groups within it. And the coach provides a glass of, or a jar of lollies. And so all these big burlies, they get in there and tear into the lollies, and today's lolly were red frogs. And one of the players had brought his young 4-year-old son along with him for the day, and he went up to get a red frog, and his dad said, no, Hugo, you can't have a red frog. How is a 4-year-old at 10 o'clock in the morning having a red frog? It'd be out of control. So dutifully, the young fella sat down and didn't take his red frog. Got to the end of the day, everything had finished, all the players had gone home, and the coach went up and grabbed a red frog, wrapped it up, addressed it to young Hugo. And how many 4-year-olds get anything in the mail these days? 2 days later, Hugo gets this parcel, unwraps it, and here's his red frog. The next day, we were at training, and this player came up and grabbed the coach in a bear hug, picked him up, and said, you have got no idea as to how important that was for my son and what it did for my relationship with my son. And you tell people that story and they say, look, it's a lovely story, but really, what does that have to do with high performance? And it has everything to do with high performance, because that coach has now a relationship with that player where they can have a high performance conversation about what needs to be done, and the player knows it's come from a place of care. So for me, great environments, it's all about making people feel safe. You can't make players feel safe about selection, but they feel safe as people, they feel seen, and they feel cared for. And if you can do that, then you create a high performance relationship or a high performance environment where high performance simply emerges.
Yeah.
And that's where our focus has to be, rather than on kicking a better drop punt or hitting a better cover drive.
Double-clicking on that, why do you think that coaches need to be vulnerable?
Again, really good question. For me, vulnerability, and the Australian male, particularly in sport,
Water and oil.
It's perceived as a weakness, whereas I see it as the secret sauce to actually developing a relationship. The ability to show some vulnerability invites vulnerability from the player, and it becomes, as I said, can become a special sauce to accelerate the process of relationship and enable people to be honest with each other. People have to understand that when you become vulnerable, there's still boundaries. There's still things you don't share. But this notion about offering up something, and for our great players, or our coaches who have generally been great players, the opportunity to share with a 2 or 3 game player is, I had exactly the same problem when I started. This notion of what I would call as normalising error is incredibly powerful. So our players are then think, it's not just me, because so many of our players think, well, it's just me. I don't have the stuff. But to hear from a great player that, no, I had this and I did X, Y, Z to get out of it is incredibly powerful, not just in terms of their technical and tactical development, but in terms of their own self-belief and their relationship with their coach. So this might not be something you cash in on that day, but the relationship is something you'll be able to cash in on maybe in 6 months' time, 2 years' time.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, it's the depth of relationship and the trust. So we work with a model, Patrick Lencioni's 5 Dysfunctions of a Team Pyramid. You may be, looks like you're familiar with it. At the bottom of that is trust, and trust is born of vulnerability. So very, very connected there. So your whole career, you've been coaching elite athletes and then coaching elite coaches, coaching the coaches of the top sports leagues and Olympians. For us in our business, we're coaching some of the top entrepreneurs in the nation. What's your take on why is a coach critical to elite performance?
Yeah, for me, performance or elite performers, anyone in fact, whether it's a grassroots or an elite performer, doesn't necessarily see what's in front of them. So to have a second set of eyes is critical. So to be able to ask great questions and to be someone, just a sounding board for them, or I think what I try to do is just to hold a mirror to their thinking, then enabling them to reflect and again ask them, hopefully a great question that they fill the void. And so you ask a question that invites them into the space, and then you step out of the space and allow them to fill it. And I think that often people don't, because they don't necessarily reflect that well, or if they are reflecting, they're thinking about what happened rather than thinking through what happened. So they sometimes are deluded by what I call the liniment sniffers, who want to pat them on the back, and because they're patting them on the back all the time, they don't necessarily see what the real world is. And so you'll often hear the term now within professional sports is within the 4 walls. And unfortunately, a lot of the decision makers are outside the 4 walls, making judgments about what's happening inside the 4 walls. And so, one of the things that I think is my responsibility as a coach developer is to make sure that people understand why they're good, but also understand that tomorrow won't necessarily be good enough. So I had a dear colleague who was working with Hawthorn Football Club when they were absolutely at their prime. And I was having coffee with him and I asked him, what is it that you'd seen? Because he'd also worked with Melbourne, Richmond, who at that stage weren't that good, but then he'd had this exposure at Hawthorn. And he sipped on his coffee and he said, they have confident humility. And as was my one, I said, okay, where do you notice this? What does it look like? Tell me more about it. And he said, well, on any given day, they understand that if they play at their best, they'll win every game by at least 1 point. So they're confident. They understand that it's about them, they have to bring their best. But they understand it won't be enough tomorrow. And so this beautiful notion that the balance is where great performance occurs is when you have the confidence in your ability, but you also understand that I have to keep striving. And so for me, with a coach, the team I've lost 4 or 5, 6, 10 games in a row, is to make sure that they understand, let's look at our systems and structures. If they're right, then we retain confidence. Because the last thing you want to be doing is chopping and changing, because players can smell fear. But if you can create some stability and yes, systems and structures are right, then we know this will turn. But understand that if we won 10 in a row, then that won't be enough tomorrow.
Yeah.
So for me, a lot of the stuff that I'll do is try and keep them in that equilibrium about making sure they have confidence, but it's also balanced by humility.
Yep, and to translate to our world, we would use Jim Collins' level 5 leaders, a balance of ambition and humility,
Yep.
Very similar. So I want to ask you about coachability. There's a question that coaches ask around coachability. How coachable as a person is something? And some people think that person isn't coachable, it's binary and it's done. But I think it's kind of a spectrum, and I'd be interested in your take on that. And a part of the output of great coaching is that a person actually becomes more coachable. So what's your take on a person's coachability?
Yeah, look, I think there is a range, as you said, and I had a boss who started, when I started doing this coach development work, he was a psychologist, and he said, you're going to face the same rule of 3 that I face. And I said, please tell me more about that. And he said, well, the first third, they'll instantly see the value in what you do, so they'll be on board. You see, the second third, they'll be wait and see. But when they see the value that's coming on, they'll be on board. And he said the last three, don't worry about. Because in the end, if you'll spend 80 to 90% of your time with the last third who are never going to come across or potentially aren't going to spend a huge amount of time or effort in it, then you're wasting your time with the other two-thirds, which I thought was great advice. But I've evolved my thinking to thinking that you need to meet every coach where they're at. And so if their appetite for coach development is this big, then you serve them within that space. So if we keep going back to this notion of what are you working on and how can I help? And for one of the coaches that I work with at the Institute, basically disengaged with the process. But I asked him at one stage, so what's the one thing that you value in terms of you getting better as a coach? He said, I actually value going and speak to this particular person who is great for me and stimulates my thinking. And so my responsibility was just to make that happen. In his busy schedule, chisel out 2 days where he could go and sit with this guy and that was enough stimulation for him. The only thing that I asked him to do was, if I organise for this to occur, then when you come back, can you sit down with me and we'll reflect? And so then it was about me saying to him, so what did you learn? How will that change your coaching? What are the things that we will see within your coaching? Can I come out in 2 weeks and see those changes have occurred? So again, from the investment that we've made in him, we've seen behavioural change occurring. So again, it's that loop that we make sure that we close the loop, and so the behavioural changes occurred. But his engagement with the process was this big. If I asked him for this much, he would have further disengaged. So I think everybody's coachable. You just have to find their level, and you have to meet them with where their level is rather than what you want to do. I think is the most important thing. Again, being coach-centred rather than developer-centred.
Again, the parallels are just fascinating for me. I mean, the phrase "meet them where they're at." The team that I work with here would be cracking up hearing you say that, because it's something that we say all the time. The context of that is we might spend a full day with a leadership team that's growing at 150% per year, and they're kicking all the goals and everything is spectacular. And then we walk out, and then the next day we go to another team and they're kind of growing or they're stagnating and having problems. And they might, the differences might be the difference between a $150 million team and a $5 million team either way. So my point is we've got to meet them where they're at in that context.
Yep. I think the other thing that I've recognised is that development isn't linear, that in the end, the people who are stagnating, it just might not be their moment. But in the end, if I'm supporting them enough, then there might be a period of time when all of a sudden that development will take off and they'll be the 150%. But the other team who are at 150% currently, they may fall into more of a lull. So again, it's about understanding them and then working within where they're at to support them where they're at. This notion of confident humility is to be able to support them where they're at that time.
In the business world, there's a saying that everyone is a coach, right? There's part-timers, there's people who are having a crack. It's a function of the market in which we play. We endeavour to seek mastery, but not everyone does that. That's fine. That's what it is. So what that practically means is that there's lots of people who are selling coaching services, most of them part-time, with vastly different outcomes. So for you in your context, how can you tell the difference between a good coach and a great coach?
Yeah, I think for me, the great coaches understand the process and they stick with the process. It's a very simple thing, this coaching cycle. And the notion of there's a difference between a coach, which is a noun, and coaching, which is a process. So the great people, they're great leaders, they'll understand a coaching process, even if they're not coaches. So I do a lot of work also with officials. And as soon as you say, okay, we're going to go through and we're going to go through some coaching process here, as soon as they hear coaching, they shut down because they think, I'm not a coach, I'm an official. I said, no. What we're talking about here is a coaching process. So coaching as a verb rather than as a noun. So rather than a capital C, I'm the coach. No, we're just using a coaching process. And if you understand the coaching process, that's the means by which you'll get everybody better.
Beautiful, beautiful. I'm going to let you interpret the context of this question as you see fit. It's a standard question I ask everybody. And so I'm writing a book at the moment. It's called Bigger Isn't Better. Better is better. It's about compounding your efforts rather than seeking goals that are too lofty that you can't actually achieve or don't actually serve you any good. So for you, what do you think that a better business looks like for you and most of the people that you deal with? Contextualize that as you see fit.
Yeah, I mean, I love that notion of better because in the end, that's all you can do. And the notion of, in a sporting sense, people will talk about marginal gains and simply compounding across those marginal gains. So if I'm 1% better every day, and that's manageable. But if I need to get 100% better in a day, well, that's going to become daunting. So this notion of marginal gains, but also the fact of just focusing on better. So I'm horrified when an organisation might say to me, listen, can you come in and fix our coach? No, that's not what I do. I don't fix coaches. What I do is we only focus on better. And so better might take some time. And indeed, my relationship with the organisation is that I'm here with the coach as their coach. I'm not here as the organisation's spy. I'm not going to tell you who to fire, who to give a pay rise to. I'll tell you exactly where the coach is at and how they're improving and what's the process we're moving them forward. But my focus is only upon better, exactly as yours is. So I love that notion of meeting them where they're at, planning out to what better looks like, then being able to observe better and then be able to feed that back into the organisation, that you can be assured this person is better because they were doing this, now they're doing this, and therefore the money that you're spending on their professional development I can actually show to you. And that's what's been one of my great frustrations, is there's so many different ways that we look to develop coaches, whether it's courses, workshops, communities of practice. There's a myriad of ways that coaches get better, and I think they all work. For me, the big search is what works best. And so there's focus on, I'm here to get you better, and what kind of learner are you? Not in terms of auditory, because we know that's not really true anymore, but this notion of I like to listen to podcasts, or I like to go and talk to people, or I like whatever way that you best learn, then I'll put you in that environment, and then we'll reflect post your exposure to that environment, and then we'll work out a plan from there. So how I overlay the coaching process of plan, do, review, adapt is always there, but how that is dependent on the individual that's in front of me.
Awesome. What's a book that you would recommend for our audience? I can kind of guess what it might be because I mentioned it earlier. Tell us about it and why it resonates with you.
Yeah, I mean, it is this notion of Will Guidara and unreasonable hospitality. It was probably the title that caught me first of all, unreasonable hospitality, and this notion about some of the ridiculous things that they did in the restaurant that took them from his terms of being a middling brasserie in New York to being the #1 restaurant in the world. And he would talk about, well, what are the characteristics? Was it great food? Well, everyone's in the top 50 has got great food. That doesn't differentiate anyone. Great service. Of course, everyone has a great service. Great room, innovative, etc., etc. He said that doesn't differentiate anyone from 50 through to #1. But what differentiated us as #1 was the focus on creating a great experience for our people. For our people, not just our customers. For our people and our customers. And so he talked, there's this lovely rule around that means that you have to be present. And so this is really present, this is really listening, so that our coach understood that the red frog for the 4-year-old was very, very important and would be very important to that player because he knew how much of a family person he was. The second thing he said, you take what you do seriously, but you don't take yourself too seriously. So there's an atmosphere of fun around it. But for me, the most important one was that one size fits one. We understand that everyone talks about one size fits all. No, one size fits one. So acknowledging the notion that everyone's experience should be bespoke to them. And that's where the great experiences come about. And if we can create great experiences, because to me, it's about how do you make people feel? Do you make them feel seen? Do you make them feel safe? Do you make them feel cared for? And if you can achieve those things, as I mentioned before, that's when you're on the way to creating great things. And I think that's what the great coaches do, is they understand the person that's in front of them, how I interact with that person. And as I said, and I've referred to a few times, it's the notion of the art of coaching. That's where the great coaches lie. And I was very fortunate to speak to a great AFL coach who had just retired, and I asked him as to why he'd retired so young relative to coaching. And he said, I've just had enough of being a chameleon. And I said, what do you mean by that? He said, well, you know what a chameleon is. It's the ability to change consistent with the environment so that you can succeed. And he said, I have 48 players on my list. And my responsibility as a coach is to look at the player that's in front of me and be able to understand how do I best communicate with that particular player at that particular time. Because I might communicate in the morning, but in the afternoon they've had a car crash on the way home, or they've had a problem with their partner, and they're different. So I have to be able to read the person that's in front of me, turn around into my toolbox, pull out the right tool to communicate in the way that the athlete needs, not the way that I want to do it. He said it just becomes so emotionally draining that I have to do that every day with all 48 of my players and with my staff. He said, I'm drained. And I said to him, if you're changing all the time, does that mean that you're not authentic? He said, no. Understand that my message never changes. My core message never changes. How I deliver it, that's always changing depending on who's the person in front of me. So I love this notion that how you coach depends on who you coach. And that refers to, again, as I said, the art of coaching.
Brilliant. Thank you. How can people learn more about you and your business?
On all the socials. I'm not a huge Twitter or LinkedIn poster, but there's stuff there. So I think my Twitter handle is @CoachLearningS1, and LinkedIn is just Coach Learning Solutions. Okay,
we'll put those in the show notes as well for listeners.
Yep.
What haven't we covered off today that you hope to cover off?
No, look, I think it's been really comprehensive, but I love the fact it's just been a chat. So I think as probably you and your listeners probably can come to terms with, I'm a coaching nuffy. And so I will talk coaching as long as anyone wants to talk about it, and been incredibly fortunate to be involved with great players and great coaches, because to be fair, it doesn't matter who I'm working with, I'm always learning more from them than they're ever learning from me. So every day is a day of growth, and I'm, as I said, very, very lucky to have been in the game that I have been, not the cricket game, but in the coaching game for as long as I have.
Well, Ash, what a great conversation it's been. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom today. And again, the parallels between what we do and what you do have just been fascinating for me. But thank you so much for your time today.
No, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the episode as much as I did. If you'd be kind enough to leave a review for the podcast, that'd be really helpful to other like-minded entrepreneurs, and then we can grow our community. If you want to find out more about our guests, head over to evolutionpartners.com.au/podcast, where you can find show notes and other additional reading. Hope to see you back next week. Until then, keep thriving.